Hello, my name is Jim Potts and I work for Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Today we're going to do a presentation on Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Youth Eligibility. The federal guidance for youth eligibility is within the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014. It actually became effective July 1st of 2015. And we also have guidance from the Department of Labor in the Training Employment Guidance Letter 2116, so it's a TEGL, and it was put out in March of 2017. As far as the state of Illinois guidance, we have several policies within that affect the eligibility for the youth. It includes general eligibility, selective service, general youth eligibility, out-of-school youth, in-school youth, basic skills deficiency, low-income individuals. You'll also notice in the bottom of this screen, there's a URL to a really handy apprenticeship resource page. And on this page, as a section for eligibility documents, which includes all of the various federal and state policies and guidance related to WIOA eligibility. It's really important that the apprenticeship expansion grantees understand that prior to reviewing this PowerPoint on youth eligibility, it is important that you view and understand the details that were covered in the previous presentations on WIOA general eligibility as well as WIOA low income. If you have not viewed those two presentations, you need to look at those and understand those prior to watching this one to get a full understanding of the youth program. As far as the youth program, as mentioned earlier, the WIOA legislation in 2014 that was effective July 1st, 2015, it broke out the in-school youth as a separate category for out-of-school youth for eligibility. And the two are significantly different from one another. This was a change from the predecessor to WIOA under WIA, which eligibility was the same for both in-school and out-of-school. First, we'll discuss the in-school youth. The details of it are described in Commerce Policy 5.4.2. And for an in-school youth, they cannot be younger than 14 or older than 21. Traditionally, most WIOA providers do not serve individuals the age of 14 and 15. Most often, I've seen them for 16 and older. To be considered in school, it's defined by state law. For purposes of WIOA, providers of adult education under Title II of WIOA, youth build programs and the job corps programs, the high school equivalency programs and dropout reengagement programs are not to be considered schools for the purpose of determining school status. There's one exception to this, and that's youth that are attending high school equivalency programs, including those considered to be dropout reengagement programs funded through the public K through 12 school systems that are classified by the school system as enrolled in school are still considered in-school youth. So what this is speaking about is if there's any high schools that have programs for adult education, for returning to school, maybe in a nighttime setting that is funded through the traditional K through 12, it would still be considered in school. But again, the exceptions are if they have any of those relationships with the adult education under Title II, they could still be considered out of school. Now, determining school status within the apprenticeship application, it's on the goals and current situation screen under education is where the question comes up. And it's simply, I am currently in school. If that is checked with a yes or marked, there's three other questions that open up that ask more details. But that is the question that's going to determine if the internal logic of the application is looking at this client as an in-school or an out-of-school youth. And here's an example. And again, as I'd mentioned, if that question is checked, it opens up the three questions below. So in this situation, and if the client is 21 or under, and the top question is checked, then the appropriate response of I'm attending high school, junior high, middle, or elementary school, or I'm attending an alternative high school, or I'm attending college, technical, or vocational school would be checked. Again, for the first one, understanding that the age, you shouldn't find anybody that's attending junior high, middle, or elementary. It should just be the high school. On this, so just to make sure everybody's going to understand that if somebody is in college or vocational school or technical school, if they're participating in college credit hours. So if somebody is taking, let's say, a remedial math and English, and that's their only courses, then they're not to be considered in school. So again, it does need to be college credit hours in the post-secondary education. So in this example, I have a client who is 21 years old, that's a high school graduate, and they are in college. So the appropriate response on this one is I'm attending college, technical or vocational. And again, the logic within the application now will be considering this client an in-school youth. Now the guidance for in-school youth requires that 95% of in-school youth must meet WIOA low-income guidelines. That's the reason why it's really important that if you have not viewed this, the PowerPoint on WIOA low income, you need to make sure to go and view that, because there are 8 different ways somebody can be low income, and we're not going to cover them all in this presentation. Besides being low income, the in-school youth must also have at least one or more of the barriers described on this page. And we're going to go in depth speaking on each one. The basic skills deficient, an English language learner, an offender, homeless, runaway, foster child or aged out of foster care, pregnant or parenting, an individual with a disability, and lastly, an individual requiring additional assistance to enter or complete an education program or to secure or hold employment. First, for basic skills deficient. This is speaking in respect to an individual who is a youth, that the individual has English, reading, writing, or computing skills at or below the 8th grade level on generally accepted standardized tests, or who is a youth or adult that the individual is unable to compute or solve problems or read, write, or speak English at a level necessary to function on the job in the individual's family or in society. So on this definition, the first section is based on assessment tests. The second one, it's more of a difficult item to determine. So within our commerce policy of basic skills deficiency, they've developed a basic skills screening tool, which would meet the second portion of the definition. And we'll touch on both of these subjects in a moment. First, as mentioned, the assessment tests at 8th grade level or under would make the person basic skills deficient. So what you're talking about here is somebody takes a TABE test or a CASAS test. And if they score at 8th grade or lower, and they're at least age 16, they would be considered basic skills deficient. Now, as I mentioned earlier in WIOA Notice 19.01, Change 1, that's the basic skills deficiency policy that was put out in July of 2020. And there's a basic skills screening tool. And lastly, if an individual is assessed as an English language learner, they will also be determined to meet this basic skills deficiency criteria. Here's an example of the basic skills screening tool. If an individual replies no to any of the following questions on the screening tool, they can be determined basic skills deficient. So the first question, do you have a high school diploma, general education development, GED certificate, or a high school equivalency diploma? If that's answered with a no, then the client would be considered basic skills deficient. But it's really important to understand that if the client's currently in high school, the no should not be responded. So this is really speaking about somebody who has dropped out of high school. For the second one, can you follow basic written instructions and diagrams with no help or just a little help? If that's responded with no, again, it makes the person basic skills deficient. 3, can you fill out basic medical forms or job applications? A response of no the person could be determined basic skills deficient. The fourth, can you add, subtract, multiply, and divide with whole numbers up to 3 digits? If that's responsive no, then the person's considered basic skills deficient. The fifth question, can you do basic tasks on a computer? A responsive no would make the person considered basic skills deficient. And the sixth question, do you speak and read English well enough to get and keep a job? An answer of no would also make the person basic skills deficient for eligibility. Now let's discuss the definition of an English language learner. The term English language learner, when used with respect to an eligible individual, means an eligible individual who has limited ability in reading, writing, speaking, or comprehending the English language, and whose native language is a language other than English, or who lives in a family or community environment where a language other than English is the dominant language. So for this definition, most generally, you're not going to find a test that's going to make the person considered an English language learner. It's typically going to be based on your assessment that is being done with the clients. But also, I'm not often real comfortable saying that somebody is an English language learner, but more maybe explaining the definition and asking the individual themselves if they feel that they should be considered an English language learner. Now, the various youth barriers are indicated at different places throughout the apprenticeship application. Many of the youth barriers, including those associated with the barriers of basic skills deficient and English language learner, are on the goals and current situation screen of the application. And here's an example. Under education, you had those questions about I am currently in school. Well, right underneath that is a question that I have a hard time with reading, writing, and or math, and I have a hard time or have a trouble with reading or speaking English. If either of those questions are checked, they are going to meet the criteria for the internal logic of the barriers of either basic skills deficient or English language learner. So for the first question, I have trouble with reading, speaking English. This is a barrier of English language learner. Shown directly below are the acceptable documentation choices for the barrier of English language learner. So you'll notice case notes from Career Planner. So that would be based on the documented assessment. Results from an authorized assessment test. So that would be somebody who might have taken some form of test. A WIOA application signed and dated. What that would be is the client, him or herself, indicating basic skills deficiency due to English language learner, and there should be a statement to accompany that. And then you have that basic skills screening tool that we spoke about earlier. Now for the question, I have a hard time with reading, writing, and or math, this is tied to that definition of basic skills deficient, and then below are the acceptable choices. So again, you have the results of assessment tests, school records verifying the applicant is unable to take a test due to their circumstances, and then a basic skills screening tool. The next youth barrier we're going to speak about is the offender barrier. The definition within the WIOA legislation of an offender is an adult or youth who is or has been subject to any stage of the criminal justice process for whom services under this act may be beneficial, or who requires assistance in overcoming artificial barriers to employment resulting from a record of arrest or conviction. So if you understand this definition, the individual themselves does not even have to have a conviction of it. They had dealings with the police, with the legal system that impedes their ability to gain employment. As previously mentioned, many of the questions related to youth barriers are on that goals and current situation screen in the apprenticeship application. And under the section of legal, as shown are the two questions related to offender. If either of these questions are checked, it would indicate the client as the barrier of an offender for an in-school youth. So I have criminal charges pending. I have had instances of legal problems. So how the internal logic works, either of those checked with a mark that's going to correlate to the barrier offender for the in-school youth. Below are from the eligibility determination screen are the acceptable documentation to support the barrier of offender if either of those questions of I have had legal instances or currently have charges pending. The next barrier we're going to speak about is homeless. If an individual who lacks a fixed or regular or adequate nighttime residence, as defined under the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, or an adult or youth with a primary nighttime residence that is a public or privately operated shelter for temporary accommodation, which is under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. The Violence Against Women Act, I find, is broader for the definition of homeless, but either one of those definitions works for WIOA eligibility. So you don't have to really consider it as somebody who is necessarily living in their car or living on the streets as homeless. It's basically anybody that does not have a permanent residence. So how it's worded within the apprenticeship application is on the goals and current situation screen, there's a section of housing. So if the question under housing of I need a permanent place to live is checked, that's going to correspond to the in-school barrier of homeless. Something else that's important to understand, being homeless is one of the automatic low-income qualification factors for WIOA. So if an in-school youth, where 95% of the youth are required to meet low-income guidelines and then have one or more of the barriers, so if the person has the barrier of homeless, it is going to be an automatic qualifier because it does meet both low income as well as one of the youth barriers. Below are from the eligibility determination screen within the application, lists the acceptable documentation that could be used to support I need a permanent place to live, which corresponds to the barrier of homeless. You'll notice one of them, it could be as much as it states a signed application. Well, that's going to be a statement within the application explaining the circumstances for the individual's homeless status. Or you can have a written statement from an individual providing the temporary assistance by living with them, a written statement from a shelter, a written statement from a social service agency that referenced the homeless shelter runaway services. The next youth barrier we're going to speak about is a foster child. And a foster child is defined as a minor on behalf of whom state or local government payments are made to a foster parent or other guardian. The question is on the goals and current situation screen under the housing portion, and it's I am in foster care. If that question is marked, it will meet the youth criteria for the barrier of foster child. And additionally, if somebody is a foster child, that is also an automatic low-income qualification factor. So with this barrier, if it's indicated, the individual, as long as they're eligible to work in the United States, plant with selective service, they would be eligible under the in-school youth criteria. Below is an example of the documentation within the application when the eligibility is determined. And you'll notice there's several different choices. Court contract, court documentation, medical card showing foster child status, verification of payments made on behalf of the child, written statement from a state or local agency. And we also have a barrier of aged out of foster care. The difference of aged out of foster care and being a foster child is both are barriers, but for aged out of foster care, it is not an automatic low income qualification factor. So the client would have to have another way of making sure that they meet the low income criteria and have this barrier. And the question is, I have aged out of foster care. And below are the acceptable, or on this slide demonstrates the acceptable documentation to support that I have aged out of foster care. Next, we're going to discuss the youth in-school youth barrier of runaway. And for this barrier, it would only be relevant for youth that are under the age of 18. is once an individual turns age 18, they're considered a legal adult, so they would not be a runaway. So it's indicated on the goals and current situation screen under housing and the question, I am a runaway. If that question is marked, it will meet criteria for the youth barrier of runaway. In this example of the runaway being populated, this demonstrates on the eligibility determination the various documentation that can be used to support runaway status. One important thing to understand about runaway, as I mentioned, it has to be under the age of 18. If a person is coming in for WIOA services and they are under the age of 18, it requires parental or guardian signature to allow the minor to participate in the WIOA program, or in this case, the Apprenticeship Expansion Program. So it's a kind of a tricky situation when you have an individual that is a runaway for the barrier, where they do need to have the parental consent or a guardian's consent in order to receive services. The next barrier we're going to discuss for an in-school youth is pregnant or parenting barrier. If a youth client is pregnant, then it is important to note that only female could use the barrier of pregnant. The male cannot use the barrier of pregnant. Or parenting, which could be either, of course, the male or the female, is used for eligibility. It's on the goals and current situation screen under family. So the questions are, I am pregnant, or I have children and would need help getting child care. Either one of those questions are going to indicate for the barrier of pregnant or parenting. Again, if it's a male, he cannot indicate I am pregnant. He could indicate I have children and would need help getting child care. And when the documentation is needed, it's for the barrier of I am pregnant or I have children and would need help getting child care, which is the WIOA in-school youth barrier of pregnant or parenting. There's various forms of documentation that could be utilized for this barrier. The next we're going to cover is the barrier of an individual with a disability. On the goals and current situation screen in the application, it asks about physical health. If either I have a disability that makes it hard for me to do certain things, or I am legally blind, it's populated with a check, the application records the barrier of a disability. What happens on the documentation section, if either one of those questions are marked, it requires then to capture the category of disability. It could be one, or it must be at least one, but it could be more of the choices under category of disability. The next would be the documentation that could be used to support the barrier of the disability. Again, if either the question of I have a disability that makes it hard to do things, or the other question, if either one of those are marked, then it will indicate the barrier of a disability for a youth. This next barrier I'm going to make sure we cover, and it's kind of something that must be really understood what we're speaking about. Now, it's for the barrier of an individual requiring additional assistance to enter or complete an educational program or to secure or hold employment. It's very important to understand that the criteria to support this barrier is determined by each local workforce innovation area in their own local policy. So if this barrier is indicated in an application, the staff must explain within the case note how the client meets the particular criteria that is laid out within the local workforce innovation area's policy on this barrier. So if you're a grantee that is the local workforce innovation area or a sub-grantee of that, then you would use your own local policy for the barrier of youth requiring additional assistance. If you're a grantee that is not associated with a local workforce innovation area, you could get the local workforce innovation area's policy and use that for the criteria. But it's important to know that those are the only acceptable documentation. A grantee who's not under the local workforce innovation area cannot make up their own barrier for this. So they would definitely need to work with the local area where they are living to get the policy to understand the criteria that could be used for this barrier. Now the question in the youth application is on the goals and current situation screen. And the question simply says, I need help to enter or complete an education program or to secure or hold employment. So I can definitely see clients checking this barrier because it makes sense when you just read it and when they're applying for the program. So it's really important for the grantee staff to understand those details about getting and understanding the local policy on this barrier. Now here's demonstrating the screen where if this barrier is indicated where the documentation that is allowed. You'll notice the only documentation really is the case note. And again, this case note would need to be supporting how the client meets the criteria within the local policy. So this concludes the section on in-school youth. It's really important to understand that for in-school youth, 95%, so basically all of your in-school youth clients must meet WIOA low-income criteria and then have one or more of the identified barriers that we just spoke about. Next, we're going to speak on out-of-school youth eligibility. For out-of-school youth, it's covered under Commerce Policy 5.4.1 for out-of-school youth. The age for out-of-school youth is no younger than 16, and they can go up to the age of 24. So for the out-of-school youth, for the school status, it's based on not attending any school as defined under state law. And as I touched on earlier, individuals attending adult education provided under Title II of WIOA or Youth Build or Job Corps are also classified as out-of-school youth for eligibility determination. So if a person is in one of those programs, they should be indicated as not attending school and put in the application. Some guidance from TEGL 2116, which is the most recent Department of Labor guidance for the WIOA program for the youth. If the youth graduates high school and registers for post-secondary education, but does not ultimately follow through with attending post-secondary education, then such a youth would be considered an out-of-school youth if the eligibility determination is made after the point that the youth decided not to attend post-secondary education. If the youth is only enrolled in non-credit-bearing post-secondary classes, they would not be considered attending post-secondary school, and therefore they're an out-of-school youth. So again, as I touched on earlier, the questions to determine school status within the apprenticeship application is on the goals and current situation screen under education. So if the question, I am currently in school, is left blank, the internal logic within the application is going to indicate the person as an out-of-school youth. The school status should be recorded based on what the client is doing at time of application, not what the client is going to enter. If the client is not attending any high school or post-secondary school, college, technical, or vocational, the question of I am currently in school should be left unchecked. When the question of I am currently in school is left unchecked, if the client is between the ages of 16 and 24, the internal logic will consider the individual an out-of-school youth for eligibility considerations. Now here's something that's important to understand. For the following out-of-school youth barriers, they do not require the individual to meet WIOA low-income criteria. So if an individual is between the ages of 16 and 24 and they've dropped out of school, as long as they've met WIOA general eligibility, which is authorized to work in the United States and compliant with selective service if you're a male, they would be eligible as an out-of-school youth. The second barrier, within the age of compulsory attendance but has not attended school for at least the most recent complete school year quarter. This is speaking about somebody where the school does not consider the individual a dropout, but the person is old enough to drop out and has not attended school in the most recent quarter. The third barrier, subject to juvenile or adult justice system. This is basically the same barrier as the in-school offender barrier, but it's titled for out of school, subject to juvenile adult justice system. The fourth barrier, homeless, we discussed that, and we'll touch on it again, but it's the same criteria for in school if the person meets the homeless status. Runaway, foster care or aged out of foster care, pregnant or parenting, and the individual with a disability. So again, if an individual has any of these 8 barriers and they're an out-of-school youth, as long as they've met general eligibility for WIOA, they are going to be eligible and not have to meet low-income guidelines. So let's speak about the barrier of high school dropout. It's captured in the apprenticeship application on the goals and current situation screen under education. And the question is simply, I dropped out of high school. If this barrier is marked, the individual who drops out of high school has not gone back. If they dropped out of high school but then went back and obtained a general equivalency degree, the GED, or they're back in school or they obtained their high school diploma, then they would not be considered a dropout. A dropout is somebody who's dropped out of high school and has not went back. If the barrier of dropout is indicated and the person is under the age of 25, then again, they're going to be eligible, and below are the different choices of documentation that could be used to verification for I've dropped out of high school. So the barrier of not attending high school in a quarter, in some instances, a high school might not consider an individual to be a high school dropout until the end of the school year. Under the WIOA legislation, the out-of-school youth barrier of within the age of compulsory attendance but has not attended school for at least the most recent complete school year quarter was added for this reason. What really comes down to for this barrier often is school districts and school systems. In some instances, they report their total school count at the beginning of a school year, and they may not determine somebody is a dropout until the end of a school year. And that was really the basis of what made this barrier come into play. Again, this barrier can only be used for an individual who's legal age to drop out and has not attended school in the last quarter, but the school does not consider that individual dropout. And it's simply, I have not attended high school in the last quarter would be the appropriate response. The documentation for this barrier, again, if a client is of legal age to drop out of high school, but the school does not consider the individual dropout, the barrier within the age of compulsory attendance but has not attended school for at least the most recent complete school year quarter was added. So on this, the documentation choices are listed. It's ironic, you cannot use an attestation for this barrier. You do need to get documentation from the high school. The next barrier we're going to speak about is subject to the juvenile adult justice system. As I mentioned, under the WIOA legislation for the in-school youth, there's a barrier of an offender. But for the out-of-school youth, they called this barrier subject to juvenile or adult justice system. In March 2017, in Teagle 2116, the Department of Labor clarified and stated with the barrier of subject to juvenile adult justice system, it has the same definition as the in-school youth of barrier of an offender, which just, we'll go over that again. An adult or youth who is subject to the juvenile adult justice system who is or has been subject to any stage of the criminal justice process for whom services under this act may be beneficial, or who requires assistance in overcoming artificial barriers to employment resulting from a record of arrest or conviction. So again, the person would not have to be convicted if they have law dealings with the police, the judicial system, that they feel is impacting their ability to get employment. This barrier can be indicated. And it's on the goals and current situation screen under legal. If either the question I have criminal charges pending or I have had instances / legal problems is checked, it's going to correspond to the out-of-school barrier of subject to juvenile or adult justice system. And here's a demonstration of the acceptable documentation that's going to be shown when eligibility is determined on the client within the application. So for the out-of-school youth barriers, for the other out-of-school youth barriers that do not require a client to meet WIOA low-income criteria as shown in the adjacent column, for homeless, runaway, foster care, aged out of foster care, pregnant or parenting, an individual with a disability, we covered all the questions within the in-school youth application as well as the documentation. So that's all the same. The difference for the out-of-school youth is that the client would not need to meet the low-income criteria, where in-school youth they would in order to meet their eligibility. So now, if an out-of-school youth did not meet any of the previously addressed barriers, there are two more possible barriers that could support out-of-school youth eligibility, but both require that the client meet WIOA low-income criteria with this barrier, with these barriers. So the first one that we'll discuss that requires the out-of-school youth to meet low-income criteria is an individual who has their high school diploma or recognized equivalent, or GED, who is low income, that is either basic skills deficient or an English language learner. We discussed in depth the basic skills deficient or English language learner, so any of the possible different criteria, whether it be assessment testing at or below the 8th grade level on either a math or reading assessment test, or using the basic skills screening tool, or meeting the definition of English language learner. If any of these are met, if the client, as long as he or she has graduated high school or has their GED and they meet low income criteria, they could use this barrier. And then for the second one, it's also for an individual who is out of school youth, who meets low income guidelines and who meets that local policy about requiring additional assistance to enter or complete an education program or to secure or hold employment. But again, it's really important to understand the local workforce innovation opportunity, or local workforce innovation areas, local policy on this barrier, because that's going to establish the criteria when this barrier is checked. For this barrier, the client will need to have an out-of-school youth that has already graduated high school or completed the GED, but is basic skills deficient for many of those ways we spoke about on slides 13 through 20. Again, for the barrier of requiring additional assistance to enter or complete an education program or secure or hold employment, we addressed those on slides 38 through 40. So this concludes the presentation on WIOA youth eligibility. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at james.potts@illinois.gov, or you can call me at 217-416-7097. Thank you and have a great day.